Just as a reminder, this is part 2 of the Will Chang interview. Please check out part 1 on rugbywrapup.com.
Brought to you by our friends of the British Council. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen. I have Mr. Will Chang standing by in California, the chairman of the board of directors for USA Rugby. Just following up a little bit more on the Rugby Channel. There are those out there saying that RIM and the Rugby Channel have made World Rugby a little bit wary in terms of giving us needed dollars as a Tier 2 nation. They're worried about the lack of success, so to speak, so far by either RIM or the Rugby Channel. What do you say to that?
We are the first, and to the best of my knowledge, the only national governing board for a sport in the United States that have spun off the commercial interest into a for-profit company. And I believe we are also the only rugby union country that has spun off the commercial rights into a for-profit company. So we're the first. We're the first in the rugby world. We're the first in the U.S. sports world. So when you're a pioneer, we get a lot of criticism. It makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Especially when they're not used to seeing the kind of structure we've formulated. But I go back to this point, and I'll keep on going back to this point. Essentially, USA Rugby, when I came on the board in 2013, was insolvent. This was the only way we could save the National Governing Board of Rugby to become solvent and become a viable organization. And that's a very important point. People can criticize and say, there's nobody else in the U.S. that does this. That's true. You can also say, in the rugby world, and I get a lot of criticism, that there's nobody doing this in the world of rugby. And it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Having said that, there's a lot of unions around the world that have financial difficulty and in similar situations as USA Rugby was in 2013. In other words, they're insolvent. I've had a number of business publications that have come to interview me. I did one in Japan. I did one in Ireland. I did one in England. Or several in England and several in Ireland, in terms of interviews with press. And they all are very interested in how we have used a for-profit entity to make a national governing board of a sport, which is essentially insolvent, to becoming financial viable and having a positive net worth organization. So yes, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And, I can't help that, but you can't deny what we've done. Just go to our website and take a look at our financials. When I came on the board, we had a negative net worth of about $500,000, and now I think the latest 2016 audited financials have us at about $2.8 million in net worth, and that's mark to market. If we take, that's at book. If we go to market, our net worth will be somewhere in the neighborhood of between $20 to $30 million. And that's from being insolvent. So I'm very, very proud of what I've done, what my fellow board members and I have done. It's been extremely painful process for me to explain this to the rugby community, because many of my friends in the rugby world felt that I've taken something that belongs to them. And yes, USA Rugby is a public entity, and I've taken public assets that belong to the members of USA Rugby, and I've commercialized them. But by doing that, I made USA Rugby viable, financially viable.
Fair enough. And you know, a point that I've made a few times is that rugby globally, specifically the professional setups, most of them are based on this socialist kind of setup. You've got the NZRU, the New Zealand Rugby Union, basically dictating everything that happens in Super Rugby. And there's going to be this clash when, you know, the U.S. market gets into rugby. We're capitalists here. And there's going to be that clash of capitalism versus that kind of socialist viewpoint. And I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying that, but that's a fact that you guys have to deal with as well. So I can understand what you're saying there about World Rugby and other people not being thrilled with the fact that we have a for-profit entity involved in this thing. Let's move ahead briefly because we're running out.
Matt, can I just?
Yes, sure.
Okay, let's just add another point, which is very, very important. You know, when I came on the board, the other thing I wanted to do was very much do something that's never been done in this country, which is to bid for the World Cup. And we were successful in bringing the Rugby World Cup sevens to the United States, and it's never been done before in the United States. The only reason, and I'm going to be on the record by saying this, the only reason why we were able to do this was because we formed RIM. Without RIM, there was no way that USA Rugby had the financial wherewithal to be able to bid for the World Cup.
Well, that segues right into my next question about the Rugby World Cup Sevens.
Okay.
A three-part question for you. Expected ticket sales. How in the world did the U.S. win the bid? And how did you convince your fellow co-owners of the Giants to allow the stadium to be used? Because that was a coup.
Really, the value proposition was very simple. United States control about 40% of the world sports marketing money that goes into sports. So if you aggregate the amount of money that goes into sports from businesses in the United States, from a global percentage point of view, it's about 40%. And so it's no secret that World Rugby would very much like to cultivate the USA market for rugby. And when we approached them, our value proposition was by allowing us to host the Rugby Sevens World Cup in the United States, we would have the opportunity to drastically and dramatically popularize the sport of rugby in this country. And I continue to believe it will. I think it will be a major milestone for our sport after July, when we host, I believe, 40 teams from around the world to compete, both men and women, in San Francisco. In terms of my fellow owners in the San Francisco Giants, and I'm going to be on the record on this point, and I've been asked many times, but on the record, as soon as AT&T Park, the home of the San Francisco Giants, were on the short list, I went to Bob Latham, who was then chairman, and Nigel Melville, and told them that I need to be recused from the selection process because I don't want to be accused of insider trading or conflict of interest. So I recused myself. And furthermore, I told Bob Latham and Nigel that I needed to recuse myself from any negotiations between USA Rugby, World Rugby, and the San Francisco Giants enterprise, which is the arm of San Francisco Giants that deals in event promotion. So on the record, I recuse myself from both negotiating and site selection.
Well, you know what? I don't have a beef with you using your position, and I'm not saying you did. I'm saying I don't have a beef with somebody using their position to help make a better situation. I think that, you know, to get the Rugby World Cup for sevens here in the United States, it had to be an attractive thing for World Rugby. San Francisco is that attractive thing. Unfortunately, it's an expensive city which presents its own challenges. But what do you think the expected ticket sales will be like?
Let me answer that. But before you go into that, let me also say that our original bid, USA Rugby's original bid to World Rugby, was that we would split the event in San Jose, Avaya Stadium, and AT&T Park, and we were going to hold originally most of the women's qualifying group stage in San Jose. And again, I was not part of putting together the bid because I needed to recuse myself. But once World Rugby had selected United States, then I was able to get involved. And one of the things that that I did, and I'm pretty proud of this, is that we, at least I felt, and also our friends at World Rugby and some of our staff felt, that it was important to provide women equity between men and women. When I was in Moscow for the 2013 Rugby Sevens World Cup, women were in a really rinky-dink stadium that held about 2,000 people, and the men were in the main stadium. And there was a disparity and inequality, and I felt it was wrong. And so one of the things that we did was to hold all the men's and women's event at San Francisco, and we will treat women's teams at par equally like men's teams. So I just want to be on the record by saying that that's one of the things that I did, and it's going to cost USA Rugby more money by being in San Francisco versus San Jose, because San Jose is less than half the size of AT&T Park. But I felt it was important. In terms of ticket sales, we're probably at about 60,000 more or less. Our goal is to sell about 100,000 tickets.
And we'll be right back with Mr. Will Chang after this.
All right, everybody, how's it going? We sip, we peel, and we slide? Nah, like this. We sip, we peel, we win.
I think I'm getting this. Grab a large or extra large freshly ground, freshly brewed hot coffee for your chance to win great prizes like free coffee for a year. Get your celebration ready. Dunkin' Donuts. This is coffee. This is winning.
Today's show is brought to you in part by Love Scotch, lovescotch.com. What's on the horizon in terms of narrowing that gap? The women's team, they don't even get really a per diem when they're with the club unless they're in the World Cup, whereas the men definitely get a per diem. And what events are going to be scheduled for the women's 15s program coming off of the excitement that they've had?
So let me address that inequality issue. I understand the inequality does exist, but both the USA Rugby Board and I are committed to narrowing that gap. Just a few things that we did. When then head coach Peter Steinberg came to USA Rugby Board and said, look, I need more financial resources to be able to hold the camp a little longer in preparation for the World Cup. Our fellow board members and I stepped up, provided some funding individually, and we raised money from our rugby community, and I think we raised about $150,000 in preparation for the World Cup, and that the fruit of that fundraising was very clear. And I was in Ireland for the Women's World Cup, and I had the opportunity to enjoy the fruits of that fundraising. And as you know, we came in fourth, a stellar performance for the women. We are also trying to create parity in the Sevens Tier 1 athlete program. I believe right now we are trying to bring parity in terms of the Tier 1 Sevens residents that are training in Chula Vista. And so we're doing what we can to narrow that gap. In terms of fixtures, we've just signed a 3-year MOU with England to do a test match. I think the MOU calls for a test match with England for the next 3 years. So it's a 3-year MOU. We're also talking to a number of other unions in terms of providing a test opportunity for the women. I think we're talking to Ireland and Wales in terms of doing test matches. So
is that for men and women?
Pardon? No, you were asking me about women, right? This is for women.
Right.
In terms of men, that's different. In terms of also what we're doing for women is we just hired a new general manager, which we've never done. We've never had for the women's 15s program. Emily Bidewell came on as a general manager, where Peter Steinberg had resigned after the World Cup, so we're now in search of a new head coach, and Emily and the new head coach will be doing more camps and more recruiting around the country to find players who can play for our country.
Okay.
So we're doing what we can to narrow the gap.
So how about the pay, like the per diem, for instance, for women? Because we just had Australia's rugby union make the first step toward that kind of bold equality move by saying, okay, our players all get a minimum base salary, and then it can fluctuate from there, but there is the same minimum base salary. And I think there are something like $46K or something. My number might be wrong. Anything in the pipeline for that to happen?
Well, as I said, in terms of the sevens program, the Tier 1 athletes, and those are the core group of athletes who are on our sevens team, both for men and women Eagles. I believe their Tier 1 base pay is more or less at parity at about $35,000.
How about the 15s program?
The 15th program, we have some work to do, and it's not at parity yet, but we're working on it.
Because usually we have the rugby weekend in November. How about including the women playing against another nation when the men play against a team from overseas? Anything in the works there?
We're looking at all those possibilities. As you know, women have less opportunity to play just because there's less teams to play. Just to give you an example, and this is not the number we've set. We, meaning USA Rugby, said. It's something that World Rugby said. In the World Cup, there are only 16 women's teams coming to San Francisco for the World Cup in sevens, and there's 24 men's teams. And a simple reason is there's just less women's country playing rugby than men's. But we are doing what we can to create opportunities for the women's Eagles, both 15s and sevens.
Okay. Is the Rugby Sevens World Cup a make or break event for RIM?
No, it won't be a make or break event for RIM. We're projecting more or less about break even in terms of the economics for us for RIM. But for USA Rugby, it's going to be a major stepping stone for our ability to be able to promote the sports. Like, for example, we have a number of community outreach programs that have taken certain portion of the revenues that come into the World Cup to support community rugby programs. And so from a USA Rugby point of view, it's going to be a major milestone, and I believe it could be the stepping stone to making rugby much more popular. And just to kind of give you where we're coming from, rugby, as you probably know, Matt, have been the fastest growing team sport in the United States for the last 4 or 5 years. I think our Rugby World Cup coming to the United States is just going to continue that trend as being the most fastest growing popular team sport in the U.S.
All right, well, final question, because we're completely out of time. We're in overtime here. We're in extra time, folks. But I'm going to get fried for this, but folks will get, maybe you get back on some other time, Will, because we could talk for hours. With the U.S. Congress meeting approaching and proposed changes to the nominating board of directors committee situation, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on how Congress works with the board of directors?
So I believe it was 2006. The folks who ran USA Rugby at that point in time went through excruciating pain to downsize the board, and I believe the board at that point in time was around the size of Congress, a little less, and it was very dysfunctional. In terms of the working relationship that we have right now, I think we have a very good working relationship with Congress. And in terms of the nominating committee, I know Bob Kimmett, who is on the USA Rugby board, is working with representatives from Congress to make recommendations both to USA Rugby board and to the Congress board for certain changes that's going to be made. But I have not seen the final recommendation from the task committee that is charged with changing the nomination structure. And by the way, this change in nomination structure is something that I believe will have to go through a bylaw change, which would mean that it would have to be approved both by Congress and the USA Rugby Board. But I have not seen the final recommendation. But I believe there is a task force that's going to be making a recommendation for certain changes to the nomination process.
Final question for you. Are the San Francisco Giants going to win this even-year World Series?
Boy, I certainly hope we do, and content. But there's folks who are much more smarter than me thinking about this.
Well, you know what? As a New York Mets fan, I am going to hit you up for box seats at AT&T Park anytime I am in California and the Mets are in town at the same time. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Mr. Will Chang for coming on. We're out of time. Will, thank you again for coming on.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to your show, and I'm delighted that I had the opportunity to address some of the concerns that our rugby community have and be able to set the record straight. All
right. On that note, folks, Matt McCarthy for Rugby Wrap-Up at Studio 34, the Fantasy Sports Network here in New York City for Rugby Wrap-Up. I think I said that already, but we are for Rugby Wrap-Up, signing off.